Tea's finished, the plates are cleared, and then Nan disappears into the kitchen and you hear the sound of a cupboard door. That sound. You know that sound. What comes out of it is going to be something specific, something that only exists at Nan's house, and you've been thinking about it since the car journey over. A generation of British children lived for that moment. Here's what was in there, and here's what happened to it. To understand Nan's pudding cupboard, you have to understand what Britain was eating before it existed. Rationing ended in 1954, but the habits it had created didn't end with it. The women who became grandmothers in the 1960s and 70s had learned to cook during years when butter, sugar, meat, eggs and sweets were all controlled by the government, when waste was not just careless but genuinely wrong, and when making a pudding meant making do with what you had. Tinned fruit was an exotic treat, a tin of peaches in syrup. Those slippery orange halves sitting in gold-coloured liquid was something you opened for a reason. Evaporated milk, poured from a small tin with 2 holes punched in the top, replaced the cream that most families couldn't get or couldn't afford. A trifle in the 1950s was not a throwaway dessert. It was an event, built in layers over the course of an afternoon, using the glass bowl that only came out for this. Sponge fingers soaked in a little sherry if Nan was that way inclined. Jelly, set the day before. Tinned mandarin segments arranged with a care that the occasion demanded. Instant custard poured warm over the top. Dream topping, piped or spooned across the surface. Hundreds and thousands scattered on top as a finishing touch that was also, in some way, a signal that this was a serious pudding. The fact that it contained tinned fruit and custard powder rather than fresh cream and real sponge was not a shortcut. It was what you had. And it tasted magnificent because it had been made by someone who knew you for a reason, and that is a flavour that no amount of proper ingredients can replicate. The cupboard itself was a post-war British institution. Most households didn't have a freezer until the 1960s, and many didn't have a fridge until later than that, which meant that the food Nan kept for pudding lived in the dry cupboard, not the cold. Tins, packets, things that kept. A tin of golden syrup with the lion on the label that had been there since before you were born. A packet of blancmange powder that came out once a year and tasted faintly of childhood and nothing else. Bird's custard powder in the familiar yellow tin. Jelly cubes in their wax paper wrapping, which you could eat raw if Nan wasn't watching. A tin of carnation condensed milk that appeared occasionally, sweetened and thick in ways you didn't quite understand but never questioned. The cupboard was a particular kind of larder. Not the sophisticated abundance of a modern kitchen, but a careful collection of things that could become something, in the right hands, on the right afternoon. Then 1967 happened, and the cupboard changed. That was the year Birds launched Angel Delight, starting with a strawberries and cream flavour that tasted like nothing that had ever actually been near a strawberry, and was completely irresistible because of it. You whisked the powder with cold milk, 2 minutes, maybe 3, and it set in the fridge into something between a mousse and a cloud. By the 1970s, Birds had doubled the entire market for instant desserts in the UK off the back of it. Butterscotch, banana, chocolate, strawberry. The flavour argument was a serious one in most households, and it was never fully resolved. In a 2015 survey by the Food Network, Angel Delight was named Britain's favourite childhood dish. Not a starter, not a main. A pudding that came out of a packet and took 3 minutes to make. That tells you everything about what it meant to a child to see Nan reach into that cupboard. And then there was Arctic Roll, which deserves its own paragraph, because Arctic Roll was not a cupboard item. It lived in the freezer, or in an era before freezers, in the ice compartment of the fridge, wedged in slightly at an angle because it never quite fitted. It was invented in the 1950s by Ernest Velden, a Czech immigrant who set up a factory in Eastbourne in 1958, producing vanilla ice cream wrapped in a thin layer of sponge cake with a line of raspberry jam between the two. By the 1980s, the dessert was so popular that more than 25 miles of Arctic Roll were sold in Britain every single month. 25 miles of a log of ice cream and sponge. When Nan produced the Arctic Roll, it meant something. It meant the cousins were coming, or someone had done well at school, or there was a reason to push the boat out that didn't require the elaborate production of a trifle. Not a pudding, a signal. So that's what existed. A cupboard and a freezer compartment, full of things that had specific meanings, brought out for specific reasons, by a specific woman who knew exactly what each one signified to the children sitting at the table. Now here's what happened to it, because the way it ended is actually more interesting than the way it survived. The first thing was the supermarket. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, British supermarkets expanded their chilled and frozen dessert ranges enormously, offering ready-made trifles in plastic bowls, profiteroles in cardboard boxes, and gâteaux in foil trays that you defrosted overnight. These were not necessarily better than what Nan made, but they were available in a way that Nan's puddings weren't. Any night, any supermarket, no waiting. The pudding cupboard had been built around scarcity, around the idea that a proper pudding was something you prepared and anticipated. When dessert became available on demand, the ritual that surrounded it started to dissolve. Not a treat, a product, and that difference quietly changed what pudding meant. The second thing was health. From the 1980s onward, the national conversation about food shifted dramatically toward nutrition, calories, fat content, and the long-term consequences of eating the things that post-war Britain had grown up eating. Angel Delight, which is essentially flavoured powder and hydrogenated vegetable fat, suddenly became the kind of thing you were supposed to feel guilty about. Nobody told Nan. She kept making it anyway. Tinned fruit in syrup became tinned fruit in juice, and then just fruit. The trifle's custard layer went from bird's powder to bought fresh custard to, eventually, a thing you ordered rather than made. The food that Nan's cupboard contained was not unhealthy by the standards of its time. It was simply food made from what was available for people who were glad to have it. But the standards changed, and the cupboard changed with them, and the things that had lived in it became nostalgic before they had a chance to become old. Arctic Roll had its own version of this story. Bird's Eye discontinued it in 1997, when sales dropped by more than 50% from their peak. There was genuine public outcry. Not polite disappointment, actual outcry, the kind usually reserved for things that matter. It came back. In 2008, when the recession arrived and people were looking for comfort and value in equal measure, Bird's Eye relaunched it, and in the first few months after the relaunch, 3 million boxes sold. By April 2009, an estimated 250 miles of Arctic Roll had reached British dinner tables. 250 miles. People had not forgotten what it meant. They had just stopped being offered it. But here's what I think actually disappeared, and it's not a flavour or a brand. It's the grammar of the thing. Nan's pudding cupboard operated on a set of rules that nobody ever stated out loud, but everyone understood. Certain puddings appeared on certain occasions. The trifle was for when the whole family came. The Angel Delight was for when it was just you. The Arctic Roll was for when someone needed celebrating. The tin of peaches was for a weekday when something needed to feel a bit special without the whole production. These were not written down anywhere. They were passed from Nan to whoever was watching, in the kitchen, on the occasions when you were allowed to help. When you were old enough to be trusted with the jelly, or to do the whisking, or to arrange the tinned fruit in the bowl in a way that looked intentional. The knowledge transferred in the doing, not in the telling. And when the occasions that required the doing stopped happening as regularly, when Sunday tea became a less fixed event, when families spread further apart, when Nan's kitchen became something you visited less often as you got older, the transfer slowed down and then stopped. When that knowledge stopped being passed on, the cupboard became just a cupboard, not a vocabulary, a collection of tins. You can still buy Angel Delight. It is in most supermarkets, in the same flavours, in a packet that looks almost exactly as it did in 1967. Arctic Roll is in freezer aisles across the country. Bird's custard powder never went away. The individual items survived. What didn't survive is the context that made them mean something. The specific woman, the specific cupboard, the specific sound of the door that told you something was coming that you had been waiting for. Go to the dessert aisle of any supermarket tonight. Count how many of those things come with any memory attached. Nan's pudding cupboard is still out there, just about, in the homes of the women who learned from the women who learned to cook during rationing, and in the memory of everyone who ever sat at a kitchen table waiting to see what came out. The tin of peaches, the jelly that hadn't quite set, the Arctic Roll that had been in the freezer since last Thursday and was slightly too hard to slice cleanly, the Angel Delight that went into the fridge at 4 and came out at tea time just right. It was built on the idea that pudding was something you waited for, prepared by someone who knew what you liked and kept it in a cupboard specifically for you. It never needed to be more than that. Tell me in the comments, what was in Nan's cupboard? What was the pudding you hoped for most? Who made it? And is there a version of it you still make today? And if anyone out there still makes a proper trifle in the glass bowl, I want to know exactly how.